Hello everyone, and welcome back to DutchGreyBeard. When I started reading The Wheel of Time back this January, there was no stopping me. Within 40 days I read the prequel and the first 4 books in the series, back to back. That's over 3,500 pages, which is a lot for a slow reader such as myself. At the end of February, I slowed my pace of reading a bit because reading these books was wearing me down a little. Robert Jordan's writing style can be demanding at times. Skipping words or sentences because you want to move on with the story is not a thing you can do unpunished. In the Brandon Sanderson novel, ironically the author that finished writing the series after Jordan's passing, you can easily fast read without missing essentials, but not with Robert Jordan. I now have read the first 12 books of the series, including the prequel, New Spring. These are all the titles that were written solely by Robert Jordan himself. The 3 volumes I've left to read were written by Sanderson, or mostly written by Sanderson. So I thought now would be a good time to give you my thoughts on reading The Wheel of Time so far. Overall, I have mixed feelings about this popular series. My emotions range from absolute adoration to boredom. The world Robert Jordan has created is huge, with a lot of countries and a rich history that spans thousands of years. It was a good thing that I kept the Wheel of Time companion at hand while reading the novels. It helped me to keep up with lore, characters, the history and much more, although I had to be careful to skip through spoilers. Just the entire system of strengths with the one power alone deserves a separate study. As with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the Wheel of Time is so well developed that it feels like a real world. The books seem to merely scratch the surface of this world. The first chapter of every book in this series opens with the same words with a few minor variations here and there. Each time I started a new book, this paragraph gave me a strong feeling of homecoming. The wheel of time turns, and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. There are neither beginnings or endings to the turning of the Wheel of Time. This is the timeline I'll be covering in this video. I started Wheel of Time in the second week of January, and I finished reading Knife of Dreams on November 11th. I will not go into the story very much, because if I did that, this video would become way too long. I'll merely pick out some of the highlights and my reading experience. There will be no spoilers. Let's take a closer look at each book separately. My first Wheel of Time experience was with New Spring, the prequel or book number 0. By then I had already seen the first season of the Amazon Prime TV show. Even though I've heard a lot of criticism on the first season of the Amazon Prime adaptation of The Wheel of Time, it was in fact this adaptation that made me return to the fantasy genre as a reader. New Spring was a beautiful introduction to the intriguing world of the Aes Sedai. I am a sucker for good ceremony, and there's a lot of that in this book. Like the initiation of the Aes Sedai, when they take the 3 oaths, or the mission that Lan Mandragoran, who becomes Moraine's warder, gets imprinted into his name as a baby, to stand against the shadow so long as iron is heart and stone abides. Some of the intricacies of the one power are explained in this book. The 5 streams that make up the one power, earth, air, fire, water and spirit, and the fact that only women are capable of safely wielding the one power. All of this truly enthralled me. I also loved Robert Jordan's writing style. He makes use of complex sentences at times and poetic prose. Take this line, for instance, about Lan's baby promise. The oath that had murmured so long in his heart became a dance his feet had to follow. Newspring was published in 2004 after Crossroads of Twilight, the 10th book in the series. It sets the stage for The Eye of the World, the first book in the actual series. For me, the TV show was a stimulating introduction to the Wheel of Time, but this first read really pulled me over the threshold. I was instantly hooked. I gave this book 83 points out of 100. After this, I instantly started reading The Eye of the World, an 800-page journey that has made a lasting impression on me. The characters are literally at the beginning of their development. Coming from this small town in the country, they are faced with huge responsibilities they never asked for. It is awesome and very lifelike how Robert Jordan showcases their struggles while growing into their new roles. This goes for all of the main characters, perhaps with the exception of Moraine. Her character is quite stagnant. This book, again, contains beautiful sentences, wisdom, and sayings that seem to come straight from the Tao. He couldn't waste time worrying over problems he could do nothing about. Or, I will do what I can, but it is beyond my power to stop the wheel from turning. The whole concept of the actual Wheel of Time that weaves the threads of everybody's lives over and over again is the core of these books to me. One of the enthralling inventions within this concept is what is called Taveren. People who are Taveren, like Rand, Matt, and Perrin, instigate the wheel to weave the web of destiny. In other words, everything that happens around Taveren nudges life or the world into a certain fated direction. I love that. As I also love that reincarnation is a given. In this first book, I became convinced that the combination of myth, the legends, the memories, and what is actually happening in the story forms a monumentally huge and profound story. I awarded this book with 98 points out of 100. Without any pause again, I continued with book number 2, The Great Hunt. At this point, in the beginning of February, reading The Wheel of Time had become a major everyday activity for me. Every spare 10 minutes, I picked up The Great Hunt, rewarding myself with a few pages of this wonderful story. While reading this series, I realized that I was undergoing an initiation, a rebirth into this wonderful genre of fantasy. The magic I received in my earlier years, reading The Lord of the Rings and the Duncton series by William Horwood, I received from The Wheel of Time, now in the autumn of my life. It is a first experience, which impact, like all true first experiences, will never fade. Jordan very slowly reveals the whole tapestry, and you have to pay very close attention. I love the ceremonial scenes, as I already mentioned, not surprising, having been a Freemason myself. For instance, when the Amelin seat enters a gathering, she is announced like this. Suddenly Ronan rapped his staff loudly 3 times on the broad paving stones, calling into the silence, "Who comes here? Who comes here? Who comes here?" The woman beside the palanquin tapped her staff 3 times in reply. "The Watcher of the Seals, the Flame of Tar Valon, the Amelin seat." "Why should we watch?" Ronan demanded. "For the hope of humankind," the tall woman replied. "Against what do we guard?" "The shadow at noon." "How long shall we guard?" "From rising sun to rising sun, so long as the wheel of time turns." I love this. Again, the whole concept of the Wheel of Time, weaving threads, is my main attraction in these books. ta'veren is further explained in this book, and the way the Aes Sedai talk about the turning of the wheel is very meaningful. Some of them wish to direct Rand into a certain path, knowing that their interference will probably be of no use. The wheel will weave the pattern around this young man as it wills, whatever our plans. Later on in the book it says, "He has no more control over his fate than a candle wick has over the flame." The wheel weaves as the wheel wills. The pattern puts everything in its place precisely, and when we try to alter it, especially if ta'veren are involved, the weaving changes to put us back in the pattern as we were meant to be. Of course, the story is captivating and intriguing, and the destiny some of the characters are facing is beautiful. But what really gets to me is the unlikely way the woven threads touch each other and influence the pattern. It is as if the meaning of life becomes irrelevant. I gave this book 99 points out of 100, the highest score I gave any book this year. My hunger for the Wheel of Time still wasn't satisfied, so after finishing The Great Hunt, I immediately picked up Book 3, The Dragon Reborn. Here, Robert Jordan, gradually and without being rushed, continues to colour the complex and enormous drawing he has made. Event after event, he spoon-feeds his readers pieces of the puzzle. The characters develop in a natural way. Rand is becoming more and more independent. His anger and misunderstanding about this adventure he has been hurled into gradually makes way for maturity and self-confidence. The way the relationship between Nynaeve and Egwene develops is also very realistic. Although Egwene is not as rebellious and bad-tempered as Nynaeve, she does have a stubborn character and does not let herself be taken for granted. This results in some entertaining confrontations between the two. A common thread in this book is the polarity between men and women. It is funny how Rand and Perrin envy each other's supposed skills in dealing with women. But ultimately men do not understand women and vice versa, with the difference that men are often left baffled when confronted with womanly behaviour, while women, like Nynaeve, cannot express themselves condescendingly enough about the stupidity of men. This contrast between man and woman is one of the elements with a strong symbolic charge about contradictory elements in a society. Robert Jordan's language forces you to read slowly. Thrillers by James Rawlins or Steve Berry I don't read half as carefully as these fantasy books. There you can easily skip sentences or read them very quickly without your understanding of the story suffering. I cannot do that with Robert Jordan. I often have to go back a paragraph because I've apparently missed something that is essential to my understanding of what follows. And since with every story twist you are presented with a small sliver of an entire world, it is important to keep paying attention. This book is again an almost perfect read for me with 97 out of 100. The fifth book in the series, The Shadow Rising, I read without pausing, and again it is one of the best Wheel of Time books. It is also one of the biggest books in this series. My copy contains 1019 pages. In this volume, we learn much more about the Aiel and their ways. Beautiful how Jordan illustrates this very unique culture. There are many scenes that impress me, too much to go into here. The magic system, with a major role for the Terangrials, is being explored further, as is the character development. For instance, the mysteriously aggressive way Aviendha behaves towards Rand couldn't be more different than how their relationship develops in later books. We also learn about Tel Aran Riyadh, the world of dreams. Regarding the alleged prophetic value of dreams in this world, one of the characters says, "Life is uncertainty and struggle, choice and change." One who knew how her life was woven into the pattern, as well as she knew how a thread was laid into a carpet, would have the life of an animal. Humankind is made for uncertainty, struggle, choice and change. I absolutely love this, as I also love the way the writer time and time again emphasizes how intricately all events are woven into each other. How many more points like that had there been, where a single decision, one way or another, affected the weave of the pattern for thousands of years? 1,000 times 1,000 tiny branching points, 1,000 times that many, all twitching the pattern into a different design. There isn't a lot that I don't like about this book. I gave The Shadow Rising 93 points out of 100. For the first time after reading The Shadow Rising, I took a break from The Wheel of Time. While reading these books, I'd been buying a lot of other fantasy from authors like Brandon Sanderson, Robin Hobb, Patrick Rothfuss, George R.R. Martin and Eric Stevenson. My curiosity about writers in this genre won from my desire to continue with Robert Jordan's magnum opus. I read all 3 books of the Rieria Revelations from Michael J. Sullivan back to back, which were a direct hit as well. And I read 1 book by Terry Pratchett, which didn't really click with me. Instead of reading 3 books a month, I now slowed my Wheel of Time reading pace to 1 book a month. At the end of March, I returned to the world where Rand, Mat, Perrin, Egwene, Nynaeve and Elaine roamed. The Fires of Heaven, book number 5, again lived up to its promise. Returning to this world felt like coming home. Reading the first paragraph of the first chapter almost brought tears to my eyes. At the risk of repeating myself, the whole Wheel of Time premise remains the most compelling thing about this story to me. How the apparently coincidental coincidence of circumstances is directed from a higher being, and how the people who fit into the loom that is set into motion by the Wheel of Time and weave a tapestry with their interactions, and how the wheel turns as it wants to turn. This book also shows the continuation of character development. Things do get more complicated with each book, and the number of characters is growing, making it difficult to keep track of them. Rand al'Thor becomes more independent, tougher and more mysterious. He largely keeps his plans to himself. Matrim Colton becomes more versatile and, against his will, has the memories and skills of many past lives. His insights into battles serve Rand well. The women, Nynaeve, Elaine and Egwene, also develop in a way that cannot be predicted. Jordan's language continues to challenge me, forcing me not to read too quickly. The pacing of the story slows down somewhat in this volume, and it is a pity that Perrin doesn't make an appearance at all. I did enjoy the parts about the circus. Some booktubers are very critical about this twist in the story, but I cannot see what's wrong with it. I rated The Fires of Heaven 95 out of 100. After book 5, I took another break, during which I read The Chronicles of Prydain by Alexander Lloyd, and returning to Jordan's world again in April was a homecoming. Lord of Chaos, the biggest volume in the series with 1,039 pages, was one of the best reads in the series. So many things going on, and another step into the depth of this story and the meaning of it all. At this point, I find it increasingly difficult to regard every book as an individual part of the Wheel of Time. Apart from the prequel, New Spring, every book I've read so far, and that also includes Book 7, A Crown of Swords, gets very high scores. In my system of 100 points, these 7 books differ only 6 points. Each book is part of a bigger whole. And that bigger whole is this immensely huge story with profound implications that seems to be set in a real world with all its complexity and apparent randomness. Just 2 quotes from this book. One is a recurring mantra that Rand has learned along the way from Lan Mandragoran. Duty is heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather. The other is just one of the many beautiful lines that breathes Robert Jordan. We are always more afraid than we wish to be, but we can always be braver than we expect. I rated Lord of Chaos 97 out of 100. My May Wheel of Time read was again eventful and precious. Still, the pacing of the story slows a bit more here, and the number of characters at times is clogging my joy in reading. But these are very minor cracks in my overall enjoyment. From the very first book, I enjoyed Robert Jordan's mastery of the metaphor. Take this example, for instance. Mirella's anger affected Brine as little as rain affected a boulder. Or when 2 Aes Sedai fight over Mat, she and Teslin stared at one another, chill and serene. 2 cats with a paw on the same mouse. After reading the final pages, I wrote in capitals in pencil, masterful. I gave A Crown of Swords 94 out of 100. In July, my enjoyment in reading The Wheel of Time took quite a plummet. Thankfully, The Path of Daggers is one of the shortest books with 587 pages. This is not a bad book, but compared to the previous ones in the series, this one is a huge step down for me. The ominous slog many booktubers are talking about is definitely there for me as well. In the meantime, I'd been reading other authors like David Eddings and Raymond E. Feist, thus expanding my horizon in fantasy. This book provoked very mixed feelings. It was great to immerse myself in Jordan's world, as it always is, but it seems to me that nothing of true importance is happening in these almost 600 pages. Of course, this perception is wrong because many meaningful events take place in this book, but compared to the previous 7, this one bored me somewhat. After reading the prologue, I wrote in the margin, every time after a break from the Wheel of Time, Jordan's prose offers me a homecoming. Not the story, his prose. 2 examples of savouring the prose. Readiness radiated from him, a lion on the brink of his charge. Nynaeve knew little more about men, about dealing with one man, than she did herself. Facing them with knives and spears was much easier than loving one. Much easier. And the rapture the one power causes continues to be enchanting. The one power flowed through her, a rush of life and joy, of bliss, and breath left her in a long gasp of pleasure and relief so overwhelming that her legs wobbled. One of the things that annoyed me was the way Fail treats Perrin. Her jealousy is too much for me. Having arrived at the slog in this very long series, I wondered what had moved Robert Jordan to write books like this. Later on, I asked myself the same question reading Crossroads of Twilight. His elaborate descriptions of inner observations by his characters, with which he deliberately slows down every dialogue, to me felt as if the author tried to postpone writing the ending of his saga. Prolonging his success, no doubt. Understandable, perhaps, but not the right way to keep me invested as a reader. I wonder what would have happened if he had not procrastinated. Perhaps he might have finished writing the series by himself. It reminds me of what I call the Mahler syndrome. Gustav Mahler, my favorite composer, had a brittle health during the last years of his life. He was diagnosed with endocarditis, a serious heart condition. He was afraid that, like a few other composers, such as Beethoven and Schubert, he would never finish his 10th symphony. So, after his 8th, the Symphonie der Tausend, he composed another symphony, which he didn't dare call his 9th, afraid that that would be his last. Instead, he named it Das Lied von der Erde. After that, he composed his actual 10th symphony, which he had to name 9. And while working on the symphony that he could call his 10th, he passed away before he could finish it. So in tempting fate, he achieved the opposite of what he wanted. In a way, I feel the same thing happened to Robert Jordan. Some booktubers find that the so-called slog is necessary for setting things up regarding the grand finale. I still have to read the final 3 books, of course, but at this point, I do not see that. I experience the slog as an unnecessary intermezzo from an author who cannot say goodbye to his life's work. I rated this book 73 out of 100. The next month, July, I read Book 9, Winter's Heart, and was enraptured by the prologue. Here an event takes place that completely restored my faith in the series. It had me in tears, and I believe it to be one of the highlights of the entire series. But then, after some 150 pages, the slowness of the story sets in again, only to speed up in the final 150 pages again. In the middle part, a lot of events are in the making, but nothing really gets done. For instance, I waited about 300 pages for an important meeting between 2 characters who are destined to be together to finally take place. The huge event at the end of this book is impressive and holds big promise for the next book. Winter's Heart scored 87 out of 100. Then, in August, I needed 23 days to read Crossroads of Twilight, book number 10. In the meantime, I had read the first Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. I'm very sorry to say that the slog from book 8 was completely back again. This book summarizes in almost 700 pages where other people were and what they were doing at the time of the great event at the end of book 9. If you read the summary on the Wheel of Time fandom wiki, every part begins saying that each character continues doing this or that. In other words, everyone goes about their business while the event in the other book takes place. In the 80 pages of the prologue alone, we get 7 different POVs, and the number of characters is insane. Many times I had no idea of the background of the person who was talking. In my August wrap-up, I showed this example. On one page, I'll show it here to you, I counted all the different names. Of the 18 characters mentioned, I only knew 2, and that is absolutely not enough to keep captivated as a reader. Every time there's something happening, the author slows it down with observations, descriptions, and elaborate thoughts of characters. Any dialogue is a chore to read because of this. Still, this is Robert Jordan we're talking about. I mean, the man was a gifted writer. Look at this sentence. Worry over being caught in a tangle of roses, even if the thorns might kill you eventually, was a luxury when you had a knife point pressed to your ribs. And no doubt things are being set up for the remainder of the story. For instance, the way the strong polarity between men and women is gradually subsiding into men and women becoming complementary of each other. Overall, my feeling of this book is that it's about nothing really, and it ends in 2 very vague cliffhangers without a real apotheosis like most of the other parts in the series. With 72 out of 100, Crossroads of Twilight is my least favorite of the Wheel of Time books. It's not very surprising then that it took me almost 2 months to pick up the next volume, number 11, Knife of Dreams. The final book Robert Jordan wrote all by himself before he passed away. Halfway October, I was ready to dive back into this world, although it took me about 27 days to finish reading this one. The final 400 pages, though, were amazing, and I flew through them. This book was a huge relief after the disappointment of Crossroads of Twilight. It cannot compete with the first 6 or 7 books, but it's a huge step up. There's finally something really interesting happening again in the story. Especially the second half of the book is old-fashioned, captivating, wonderful, and amazing. There are some beautiful scenes that really brought me back, the euphoria I felt for Jordan's writing at the beginning. It is as if Mr. Jordan at the end remembered his old magical writing flow that he started out with. I rated Knife of Dreams 84 out of 100. Overall, reading The Wheel of Time up to this point has given me many highs and some lows. As I mentioned in the beginning of this long video, this series is an initiating read for me. In that respect, these books will always be dear to me. Now I've only the final 3 books in this series left to read, which have a huge Brandon Sanderson share in them. That will be done in the coming few months, no doubt. I'm very much looking forward to continuing reading The Wheel of Time. Here you can see how I ranked the 12 books. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until we meet again at DutchGreyBeard.